I used to work for an accounting firm where one of my responsibilities was writing proposals. And the biggest that I ever worked on was a 6-figure deal for a government agency that was massively important to my boss, his boss, and the boss's boss. For this proposal, the request stated that our submission couldn't be emailed. It had to be printed and delivered by a specific time or we would have been disqualified. At 6 o'clock the night before the proposal was due, we were still making edits to the document despite the fact that it had to be across the country by 1 p.m. the next day. In that moment, my boss was in a flop sweat and I knew we were in trouble. Now, there's obviously some valid points to be made here about the dangers of waiting until the last minute, and yet we all face crisis moments like this at work, and obviously the higher you go in your career, the more people are watching and the more complex these moments become. In my case, what I wanted to do, which was kick the printer and cry, wouldn't have been nearly as helpful as what I actually did, which was call around and find a way for us to literally meet the FedEx guy at the airport so our proposal could go in with all the other overnight mail. Despite our clumsy delivery, we wound up getting that job, but I've always felt that another win, and an equal one in my book, was the way that my boss and I handled that situation together. We were pretty panicked, but through the worst, when we were bracing for the real possibility of being disqualified and the fallout that would have caused at the firm, we still communicated with each other calmly and with respect. You might be thinking that we're just lucky, that we happen to be blessed with the gift of composure in the sense that some people are born with it and some aren't. And while I can't speak for my colleague, I can say from my own experience, that's not true. In fact, for the first 15 years of my career, my default reaction to stress was always highly emotional, fairly stubborn, and it cost me at least one promotion that I know of. If you ask, most mindfulness teachers have some version of this story because the running joke about this practice is that it's not something you discover when things are going well. Mindfulness tends to be something we attempt only after we've wasted a lot of time exhausting other options and nothing seems to work. But because mindfulness is so good at helping us manage ourselves, it's why schools are using it to help kids cope with stress and overcome trauma. It's why sports teams are using it to help athletes stay centered under pressure. It's why doctors are using it to help patients manage chronic pain and overcome addictions. It's why the military is using it to help soldiers facing PTSD. And it's also why mindfulness is being rapidly adopted by business leaders who understand that as our world gets faster and our challenges get more complex, people who can stay calm and anchored in the middle of that are the ones companies need on the front lines of everything. It's this last topic, mindfulness as a leadership tool, that we'll be discussing throughout this course. My colleague Deborah Hickok and I are going to walk you through the basics of how to live more mindfully so you have a better understanding of how to use these practices at work and beyond. Jon Kabat-Zinn, one of the pioneers who brought mindfulness training to the West, defines it as the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose, in the present, and non-judgmentally. A lot of people think they do this already, but as I've learned with countless clients over the years, when we really stop and get honest with ourselves, there's a good chance that most of us would discover our minds are not actually all that present, and certainly not all that free from judgment. And so as you begin the process of being more mindful, remember it's the awareness that you're looking for, because awareness is what allows you to change your relationship to your thoughts, or more specifically, it's what allows you to observe what's happening in your head versus getting swept away by it. For students who are new to mindfulness, and particularly those who come to this work with high levels of ambition, sometimes there's a fear that a calm mind will somehow diminish their drive or their edge. This idea always reminds me of a cartoon I saw once at a meditation retreat where 2 monks were doing a crossword puzzle and the answers were across nothing, down nothing. These types of cartoons are funny, but serious practitioners know that the goal of mindfulness is the opposite of not thinking. It's to be fully aware of what you're thinking without being overwhelmed by it. The goal is awareness, which for our purpose can also be described as wisdom, and the way you get to that state is once again by paying attention on purpose, in the present, and without judgment. This is what allows you to catch yourself before you act on triggered thought patterns like anger and recondition yourself to respond with composure. Until fairly recently, it was believed that the human brain developed until our mid-20s and then began a slow march of cognitive decline that continued until we died. These days, however, what scientists are discovering is that our brains aren't quite so static. In fact, they're actually more like a computer in the sense that there are exercises that we can do to continually upgrade our programming, meditation being at the top of that list. In fact, dozens of studies now irrefutably conclude that mindfulness meditation produces documented neuron growth in the areas of our brain responsible for self-awareness and emotional control. This is obviously great news from a career perspective, given how much those traits are associated with remarkable leadership. We'll cover meditation separately in this course, but I do want to point out that there's a classic introduction to mindfulness meditation called Counting Breaths included in today's materials that I encourage you to do at least once every day over the next week. Counting Breaths is a terrific exercise because its purpose is to call attention to all the ways our brain attempts to distract us from tasks we perceive as difficult or uncomfortable, which is quite illuminating once you begin to pick up on how frequently this happens. And so this brings us to an interesting question. Why do our brains get so distracted? And better yet, why do they seem so hardwired to cause us so much suffering, as the Buddhists call it, or discomfort in more general terms? One reason appears to be that, like most species, we evolve for physical versus psychological survival, in the sense that our brains are programmed to avoid threats versus to be content within our surroundings. This threat filter not only explains our inherent negativity bias, meaning our tendency to focus on negative versus positive experiences, but it also explains why our first reaction to challenging people and circumstances is usually some form of offense or anger, despite the fact that we know that collaboration and composure are always more helpful in the long run. So what this means is that if we don't use tools like mindfulness to interrupt our pre-programmed threat filters, our negativity bias, and the alarm bell part of our brain called the amygdala, then what tends to happen over time is that we condition these impulses to become stronger until eventually triggered reactions become all we know. Remember the tale of Chicken Little, who was always in a constant state of panic under the mistaken belief the sky was falling? Again, if you're unable to observe your thoughts without embodying them, then over time you become the Chicken Little of your own life, which means getting jerked around by your emotions and falling victim to varying degrees of agitation and neuroses. Obviously, this isn't going to do much for your personal happiness, much less your leadership skills, but the good news is that once you catch on to what the brain is doing, you're far less likely to fall victim to its compulsions, triggers, worries, and wanderings, which is the true power of this work. Throughout this course, we'll be talking about specific and practical ways to incorporate mindfulness into your day, starting with the Counting Breaths meditation I mentioned earlier. But I want to close this first video by sharing just a few benefits that you'll gain by starting a serious mindfulness practice. In the story I shared at the beginning of the video, I spoke of how mindfulness is helpful when it comes to handling pressure cooker situations at work, but there are literally dozens of other benefits, including an increased ability to focus on one task for an extended period of time versus falling victim to endless distractions and compulsions, a greater ability to be present in the moment versus ruminating on the past or projecting into the future, a greater ability to handle significant change and loss and to navigate through those things with composure versus resistance. And along that line, mindfulness tends to dramatically increase our capacity for kindness and empathy for all beings, which tends to explain why those who go deep into these practices suddenly find themselves not only with more functional versus dysfunctional relationships, but also becoming activists for social justice. And last but not least, one of my favorite benefits of this practice is that when you've used mindfulness to dissolve or turn down the shrieking volume of the inner critic, then what happens is you turn up the volume of your intuition or inner wisdom, resulting in less reaching and grasping in your life and more trusting and allowing. Those are some pretty compelling advantages, and I didn't even get into the health benefits of mindfulness and reducing the stress-related conditions that plague so many of us. Believe me, I could go on, but I think at this point, rather than listening to me tell you about mindfulness, it's best if you begin to do it. Please take a few minutes to begin your practice of mindfulness using the Counting Breaths meditation included in today's materials, and let us know how it goes on the Awake Exec Facebook page. I look forward to connecting with you there.